We do have evidence on this, in particular evidence from the last set of Trump trade wars, because economists were able to look at the prices of imports, how they varied according to the tariffs being charged and what happened. The disappointing news is that it's almost entirely passed on to domestic consumers. So it wasn't a reduction in the prices that foreigners were charging to enter the US market. It was an increase almost one for one with a tariff rate for domestic consumers.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And this week we're going to talk about tariffs because, of course, we have just seen President Trump being inaugurated for his second term, and with that, his announcement of plans to impose significant tariffs on imports. And I rather think we're going to hear a lot more about that over the coming weeks, months, and years. So this is a great opportunity to talk about exactly what tariffs are, why they might be used, do they work as intended, and what might the impact of any new tariffs be if President Trump does indeed impose them. So to help answer those questions, I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Levell, my colleague, Deputy Research Director here at the IFS, and an expert on the economics of trade, which is what tariffs are all about. So Peter, welcome. Let's start with the simple bit. What is a tariff?
Well, a tariff is a tax. It's a form of tax, and it's specifically a tax on imported goods. It could take many forms. So it could be a percentage of the value of the goods you import, or it could be what we call a specific tariff. So every kilo of fruit you import, you pay a certain amount of pennies on the fruit you're buying. But it's just another tax. It's a tax on imports.
A tax on imports. Tariff is a tax on imports. Do we have any? Here in the UK?
Yes, we do. Yes, the UK still levies tariffs. So if we don't have a trade agreement with a particular country, so with the EU, we don't have tariffs because we've got a trade agreement with the EU, which means that there's no tariffs either way on trade with the partners there. But for other countries that we don't have trade agreements with, if you import a good from that country, then you'll have to pay a tariff on those imports. Not all imports are covered by tariffs. The tariffs vary across different types of imports. We tend to pay more tariffs if you're importing agriculture produce and other things, but the tariffs are there.
And what sort of scale are we talking about at the moment?
So they're pretty small, actually. So the average on tariff on UK imports is about 3%. So it's pretty small. They raise about £5 billion in revenue, which is about 0.5% of the UK's total revenue, so not very much. In the past, those numbers would be a lot higher. So in the late 70s, it would be more like 2% of revenue came from tariffs. And the rates of tariffs would be much higher. And the reason for the decline is that over time, developed countries, in particular between each other, have reduced tariffs, especially on manufactured goods. There have been successive rounds of negotiations where they've agreed to cut tariffs on each other's products. There's been spread of free trade agreements. So tariffs are a much less important source of revenue than they were in the past.
Let's go down a little bit of a byway here and talk about what you said about our trade with the European Union. No tariffs between us and the European Union. And yet people still worry that having come out of the single market and customs union makes trade more difficult, but others will say, well, look, no tariffs, no problem. I mean, so tariffs are not the only barrier to trade.
No, exactly. So there's other barriers to trade, which economists helpfully call non-tariff barriers, for all the barriers that aren't related to tariffs. Actually, in quantitative terms, they're much more significant in impeding trade than tariffs. So of the order of 5 times more important for determining the cost of trade than tariffs. And they cover everything from the fact that, if you there's now a customs border between the UK and the EU, so goods need to be checked. You need to say what they are. You need to say that you've got approval to bring them in, that they satisfy the right regulations, that they're actually made in the UK, and so shouldn't be subject to a tariff, from having been imported somewhere else through the UK. So all these checks add costs to our trade, and that's what economists were kind of worried about when we came out of the customs union, affecting our trade with the European Union. So it's not about the tariffs; it's about all these other costs that are involved in trade now that weren't there before.
Okay, well let's leave that to one side. It is an important point that we talk about tariffs a lot, but that's not necessarily the thing that most constrains trade between different countries. Now, to many people thinking about this in a common sense kind of way, tariffs sound like rather a good thing. I mean, generally speaking, we say, well, we don't really like imports. We've got a big balance of trade deficit. We quite like it. And I'm talking here from a sort of common sense point of view, not necessarily an economist's point of view. And those two things aren't always the same, I think it's fair to say. If you put a tariff on stuff that's manufactured somewhere else in Germany or China or what have you, that encourages you to build stuff in your own country, and that makes you richer. So what's wrong with that argument? Because it's I think what President Trump to some extent has in his mind, and I think it's what many people kind of naturally think, because we're sort of brought up to think that imports bad, exports good.
Yes. Well, you're right. So economists tend to take a dim view of tariffs in general. They think they're a poor way to raise revenue. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that they're sort of inherently they're discriminatory. You tax cheese more if it comes from abroad than it comes from.
Well, isn't that a good thing? Don't we want to support the British cheesemakers?
Well, on the one hand, you do, but the sort of counterintuitive thing is that economists see the gains of trade as arising through imports. So the purpose of trade, you export things because you want to import other goods. Exports as a means of paying for those imports. Imports are what adds to our ability to consume more varieties of products, better quality products, cheaper products. So the economists view the gains from trade of coming through imports, and tariffs frustrate that process. And what they mean is they distort where the country places its resources, its labor, into away from manufacturing things that it's good at and into things that it's pretty bad at making that would be better made elsewhere. And that's what creates a source of inefficiency that introduce costs from introducing these things. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, that's probably the main reason that economists don't like tariffs as a means of raising tax. They prefer broader-based taxes that don't discriminate between foreign domestic imports and which don't distort consumers and producers' choices in those ways.
And I think there's a sort of, it is important to get one's head around this almost inverse way of thinking. As I say, often in the news, one is led to believe that, as I say, an import is a bad thing because someone else is getting the benefit of making it, and it's creating a trade deficit for us. But actually, thinking of it the other way round, if we're importing stuff, we are getting the gains of other people's work. I mean, they're doing the work and we're consuming their products, whereas when we're exporting stuff, we're doing the work and they're getting the benefit. And that's why if we could just, if in a world in which we could just sit back and import everything, that'd be great.
Yes, no, exactly. If other countries completely subsidized all our consumption, from an economist's point of view, that would be great. We'd have to do nothing, and we could still enjoy the living standards we do. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We have to work to export things so that we can afford these imports that we want to buy. There are other problems with tariffs on top of the ones I mentioned. One is that they tend to end up being quite complex. They tend to vary quite a lot across quite similar products. There tend to be all kinds of exemptions and things that firms can apply for. There tend to be exemptions for favored trading partners for countries that you like, and harsher tariffs for countries you dislike. And all this complexity creates cost, because, particularly for businesses, because it means that there's a lot of scope to reduce your tariff burden through lobbying and litigation and legal cases. And it puts people's activities into those sorts of wasteful activities as opposed to the actual productive activities of investing and training your staff and hiring new staff and so on and so forth. So that creates an additional distortion. And that complexity also means there's a lot of uncertainty generated by tariffs. So when maybe we'll talk a bit later about some of the trade wars that we've had in recent history. Tariffs were going up and down as those wars flared up and resolved. That created an enormous amount of uncertainty for firms in terms of where they're going to make their investments, what they can do and what they can't do. And all of that's bad for investment and ultimately for productivity. And the final reason to really dislike tariffs as a means of raising revenue is that other countries don't particularly like it when you impose tariffs on their imports, and they will impose countervailing duties on your exports and tend to retaliate. And that also creates, gums up the global trading system.
Makes everyone worse off.
Makes everyone's worse off.
Yeah.
So, for all those reasons, I think economists are pretty against tariffs as a means of raising revenue before you raise revenue through other means.
Yeah, I think that's it's something we often don't talk about enough. I think the point that you made about the impact of certain kinds of charges or regulations and so on lobbying and uncertainty. And it's I don't know if we have numbers on this, but clearly firms spend a lot of money, particularly in the US, but not just in the US, on lobbying government. And the more opportunity you give to lobby by creating complexity, by creating chances to adjust taxes, tariffs, or what have you, the more cost that imposes. But perhaps it's also worth just going back even one step further than that and sort of explaining again, really, why trade happens and why we think trade is a good thing and why countries export and import. Because there's a very, very fundamental sort of concept in economics, isn't there, called comparative advantage. And the whole point of trade really is that where we have a comparative advantage in something, we should be making it and exporting it, and someone else has a comparative advantage, they should be making it and exporting it to us. And that makes everyone better off. But perhaps it's just worth, because it's such a fundamental point. I think it's fundamental to understanding why we think generally tariffs are a bad idea, but it's also fundamental to understanding why trade happens and why trade makes us all better off. So give us the primer in comparative advantage as it applies to trade.
Yes, so exactly. As you said, this goes back to the kind of origins of modern economics. It's the kind of debates about why countries trade and why they might gain from trade. The key reason is that people, they're good at some things and less good at other things. So it makes sense for people to specialize in the things that they're good at. And when countries aren't trading, they're having to produce everything they need for themselves, including spending a lot of resources producing things that they're not very good at making. And when trade is permitted, what you'll see is that countries start to specialize in the activities that they're relatively better at than other countries. And as a result, everyone working together can produce more than countries can produce alone. So that's one source of the gains from trade, is just this specialization in the activities that you're relatively better at. And it's important that we mention this relatively better at, because one country can, in principle, be better at doing everything than another country, but it can still gain from trade because it focuses on those things that it's relatively better at than other countries, whereas they focus on the things that they're relatively better at. And that frees up resources to produce more overall. So that's one source of gains from trade, which, as you say, is the comparative advantage. I think we're increasingly understanding that there's more gains from trade from besides that. So, for example, also, an old rule in economics is that the degree of you can achieve economies of scale is limited by the extent of the market. Is an old Adam Smith quote maxim. So what trade does is it means that markets get bigger, which means that firms can achieve these economies of scale. You can get bigger factories in one place, which means that the overall goods trade becomes cheaper. And the other thing is that trade is a source of competition. So for domestic producers, they now have to compete with foreign producers, and that means that keeps them on their toes. So tariffs, they can actually reduce the degree of competition that firms face. It means that firms can make more profits. It means firms can be lazier. It means they don't have to spend as much innovating or investing or making better products. And it's this dynamic source of gains from trade that I think is understood as increasingly important.
So we could have had massive tariffs on car imports and we'd still all be driving British Leyland cars, which would be breaking down every 5 miles.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. Yeah.
So that's the argument against, but there are arguments in favour, aren't there? We've seen considerable disruption from trade in recent years. I mean, at least part of what happened in the UK in the 1980s was that we started importing more of our manufactured goods, and that led to mass unemployment. We've had something across the West, and in particular in the US, in the last 20 or 30 years, sometimes called the China shock. China enters the world trade system, starts exporting huge amounts of manufactured goods, with the result that big factories close down in communities where that's pretty much the only employer, and the social consequences can be pretty devastating. And hence the argument goes, we would have been much better off had we imposed some tariffs, because whilst, yes, consumers as a whole got a bit better off as a result of these reduced costs of manufactured goods, the consequences for some communities were so dire that we really should have done something to stop that.
Yes, so that's, it's not all against tariffs, so that there are some reasons why you might want to impose them. One is yes, to deal with these exact sudden surges of imports. And these did occur in the 2000s. China entered the world trading system in a really big way. There was a really rapid expansion in imports from China, partly because there had been agreements that limited Chinese exports in certain areas, and those agreements expired, and there was a big expansion, for example, in textile exports from China. And communities had to adjust to this very rapidly, which meant rapid factory closures, mass layoffs, with all the social consequences that went with them. So that might be one reason you want to introduce a trade barrier, is not to prevent that process, because in the long run we want to realize these gains from trade we've been talking about. But in the short run, you want to prevent these kind of sharp episodes of disruption. And in fact, World Trade Organization rules actually do permit countries, in the face of very rapid changes in trade patterns, to impose measures that might slow these things down. Of course, you have to be careful that short-run help doesn't turn into a kind of long-run permanent feature of your tax system that you can never get rid of, because you eventually run into the game of dealing with special interests and things like that. But it's a perfectly sensible suggestion to try and introduce trade barriers to kind of slow these things down, and governments often do that.
So that's sort of all sort of fine in principle, as it were. I think one of the arguments about China and tariffs is that, to some extent, they don't play fair, that the Chinese economy is not a sort of standard market economy in the way that many other countries are, that there's quite a lot of state support and subsidy going on, and therefore the trade, as it were, isn't fair. That the Chinese, whether it's their electric car manufacturers or their wind turbine manufacturers, or whoever they are, they've been heavily supported by a state which is wanting to promote additional exports. In that world, is there a different argument, or are we still better off allowing the Chinese to subsidize these things, and in the end, as it were, we just get cheaper products as a result, or is this distorting world production to such an extent that we'd be better off imposing tariffs?
Well, to an extent, it goes back to what we were saying before, right? So if a country starts subsidizing its exports, that can be good for you, because it means all the things you're importing are cheaper. So the country overall becomes better off just because the things it's importing are cheaper. I think the concern arises, though, when you think that industries that are particularly important to your country are being destroyed by this competition. So it might be strategically important industries. It might be a question, do we want to have the capacity to manufacture steel, for example, in this country, or should we all import it from abroad if it's cheaper? Or do we want to maintain the facilities and the know-how of doing these things? If we think of something like electric vehicles, I think this will be a major growth industry. We don't want our nascent manufacturing capability to be snuffed out immediately by cheap imports from abroad before we've got a chance to learn how to do these things correctly. So it's a kind of question of trading off. On the one hand, you get cheaper things, cheaper solar panels, that's great. But on the other hand, it might undermine kind of the human capital ability to produce things. So you might want to introduce trade barriers then to protect these certain industries that you think are particularly important.
Yeah, and that's clearly a difficult set of trade-offs to make. I mean, you mentioned earlier that we've been through periods of trade wars in the past. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it, the extent to which tariffs have been at the centre of politics for centuries. I mean, anyone who studied what's now GCSE history, certainly O-level history in my day, talked quite a lot about the Corn Laws, which was essentially this huge issue in British politics in the 19th century, which was all about tariffs. There were tariffs on imported agricultural goods, which were designed to protect farmers in the UK and England in particular, which was great for the farmers who tended to be wealthy landowners, but not so good for poorer people who wanted actually cheap food. So we were supporting an industry, but at the cost to the consumer. And essentially that's sort of the argument we're still having, nearly 200 years later.
Yes, no, exactly, and I think it's partly what we were just saying is that these tariffs are often about politically important industries. They might be strategically important industries, or they might be culturally important industries. Agriculture is often very important for a nation's sense of self, so it's often something that governments seek to protect. And these disputes are nothing new. The Obama administration imposed tariffs on Chinese tires. George W. Bush, there were tariffs imposed on steel exports from Europe and from China. So these things aren't particularly new. They're often part of what a president does. I think what's new about the sort of Trump tariffs is that they're not about a particular industry or in response to a particular surge in imports. They're in response to sort of general concern that other countries are taking advantage of the U.S. and much more broad-based tariffs are being discussed and were indeed imposed in his last term than has been the case in the recent past.
And indeed, it would be a sort of, to some extent, a reversal of a long trend in history. I mean, you said right at the beginning of this podcast that tariffs now are lower than they were 30, 40 years ago, and indeed, if you look over a fairly long sweep of history, we've been moving in that direction towards freer trade and lower tariffs.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, exactly. So we've been negotiating tariffs down for decades, and now some of that seems to be set to go into reverse, possibly quite rapidly.
It is worth saying, and I think the sort of example of the Corn Laws is a brilliant example to bring that up again. The person who pays the tariff, it sounds great because it sounds like it's the foreign manufacturer who pays the tariff, but actually quite a lot of it in most circumstances ends up getting paid by the domestic consumer.
Yes, exactly. So who pays for tariffs is, very important question. Certainly the statements of Donald Trump on the campaign trail sort of implied that, this view that the tariffs would be paid by foreigners, and would be just a source of revenue for the U.S. The truth is a bit murkier. So we know, as with any tax, it's going to be a mix of some of the tax will be paid by the consumer, some of the taxes will be paid by the producer. So on the one hand, tariffs, it all depends on how much the tariffs are passed through onto consumer prices. To the extent that the tariffs mean that foreign producers of the goods you're importing have to cut their prices to remain competitive in your market, it'll be incident on them, so they'll be paying it. But to the extent it raises consumer prices that people are paying in your domestic market, it's paid by the domestic consumers. And we do have evidence on this, in particular evidence from the last set of Trump trade wars, because economists were able to look at the prices of imports, how they varied according to the tariffs being charged and what happened. The disappointing news is that it's almost entirely passed on to domestic consumers. So it wasn't a reduction in the prices that foreigners were charging to enter the US market. It was an increase almost one for one with the tariff rate for domestic consumers. Now that's possibly a bit unexpected. We'd expect it to be shared at least to some extent. It might be the fact that we only have a short period of time to evaluate the effects of these tariffs. So in the short run, it might all be incident on U.S. consumers. In the longer run, things might shift, prices might adjust in ways that some of the tariff is paid by the foreign exporters. But ultimately, it's going to depend on exactly how prices change when these tariffs are introduced.
But that's very striking that the short-run effect appeared to be entirely on consumers. And again, if you look at some of the agricultural tariffs in the past, clearly a large chunk of that has ended up being on consumers, but uncertainty about exactly how it falls. I suppose one of the questions here is about the sort of worldwide dynamics of this. I mean, if President Trump wants to introduce tariffs, let's sit the UK out of this for a minute and say Trump imposes tariffs on China and maybe one or two other countries, doesn't impose tariffs on imports from the UK. Can we sit back and think, well, no problem for us, or are there likely to be sort of wider ramifications of what might happen as a result of people either directly from those policies or as a result of other countries responding with their own tariffs?
One of the sort of interesting things about trade is it's a very complicated web of relationships between countries. So now, most things we buy contain components that are manufactured in a whole set of different countries. These multinationals have these widespread global value chains, which means it's not just one thing is made in one country and exported to another. The inputs to make that thing are imported from all over the place, then they're assembled in one place, and then they're sold in another. And that means that these tariffs kind of reverberate throughout the global economy in quite complex ways. So even if the UK isn't directly affected by these tariffs, I suppose we get sort of exemptions or something, we persuade the U.S. administration to look kindly on us.
Special relationship.
We rely on the special relationship. We'd still be very much affected by them. So, for example, if there's a German manufacturer that exports to the U.S. and that now has to pay a tariff, but that purchases its inputs from some UK suppliers, those UK suppliers are going to be affected by the tariffs affecting Germany. At the same time, UK producers might buy things from US producers that might see their costs rise as a result of these tariffs on their inputs, and that might introduce inflationary pressures to the UK. The other thing that might happen, which would be potentially good for us, is what we call trade deflection, which is when, say, the US imposes steep tariffs on Chinese steel, for example, and then that steel needs to find a new market. So what happens is the price of that will go down, and the price that we pay for our imports would then fall. That
may even further destroy the British steel industry.
Possibly steel wasn't the right example, but you can see that so there are benefits in terms of improves our terms of trade. It lowers the prices of our inputs, but that also might create additional pressures in the UK to introduce our own trade protections, and we have seen that in particular in the example of steel before.
So a lot of this will depend on the dynamics. If what transpires is what you've sort of described there, and transpires in quite a big way, whereby, for example, Chinese steel, Chinese cars or whatever get deflected to other markets, including ours, at lower prices than they are now, that might well result in a response from a lot of other countries. Say, well, we can't cope with this kind of pressure on our industries. Let us put on tariffs. And I guess that's one of the reasons that maybe over long periods you see tariffs going down and tariffs going up in concert, rather than individual countries being staying alone in how they respond to these things.
Yes, exactly. And then all of this would, of course, be much more chaotic if there's a tit-for-tat trade war where the US imposes tariffs on, for example, China imposes retaliatory tariffs, as it did in the last trade war, on goods from America, and Europe does the same. And then we see tariffs rising above across the board in a kind of destructive trade war.
Does all of this mean that the World Trade Organization is essentially toothless? We're supposed to have a global institution which is whose remit really is to over time reduce trade barriers. But if a big country like the US could just do what it wants, and everyone then does tit for tat. I mean, does the WTO have any teeth?
Yeah, so the World Trade Organization is the kind of policeman of world trade and world trade agreements. So it's so countries have agreed to lower their tariffs versus each other. There are reasons why they might raise those tariffs, and the World Trade Organization is there to decide whether those reasons make sense. You actually have a justification for doing it. Maybe you think there's unfair competition. Maybe you think there's some culturally sensitive industry. Maybe you think there's a sudden surge of imports that means that you are entitled to some protections. And in theory, these things should go to a panel that would adjudicate on the dispute, and countries wouldn't retaliate unless they were told by the WTO that they had the right to impose what they call countervailing duties on the country that was deeming engaged in practice they deemed unfair. But what we saw, recently is that this entire process has fallen by the wayside. So the United States, when it introduced tariffs in the last Trump administration, I mean, it was only talking about domestic legislative reasons for introducing these things. In that case, national security on steel, but also on a whole range of products which clearly had nothing to do with national security. The WTO, I mean, the whole process is completely sidelined. There's an appeals process, but the United States is blocking judges to being appointed to the appellate court in the WTO. I think what we're seeing is the rule book completely being torn up with regard to multilateral trading relationships. And so I think it's going to be a bit more dog-eat-dog what each country can do, and the raw power of countries in the world trading system will probably determine whether they get outcomes that they like or not.
So yeah, that's that the way you put that sounds quite concerning, but it does feel that we have gone through quite a long period of increasing international cooperation and rules-based trade system to one where that international rule maker has very limited powers, and we're reliant on the good behaviour of particularly the big blocks, the European Union, the US, China. The UK as a relatively small player in all of this, without the protection of the WTO. We probably should start to bring this to a close, but I mean, we are inevitably focusing on what the US is doing or might do. We still don't know what they're going to do, whether they're going to invade Canada or whatever they're going to do over the next 2 or 3 years, and the impact on us. But of course, the countries that are possibly most exposed to whatever's going on in world trade are the poorer countries, the global south, the low and middle income countries, often very dependent on exports of minerals, primary goods and agricultural goods, and dependent for their development on importing other goods. I mean, how much of a worry for them is this breakdown in the international order and the potential behavior of a Trump administration?
So I think, I mean, no one's talking about imposing tariffs on primary products of the kind, oil and minerals and things, because, actually most countries want to get their hands on as many of those things as possible. I think, certainly there was a period when there was pressure on these big trading blocs, and particularly the European Union and the United States, to kind of liberalize their agricultural trade in ways that would allow these countries to export more in the areas where they have comparative advantage, which may be more in these sorts of products.
It's always been a big argument against the common agricultural policy of the European Union.
Exactly. And there was pressure, and changes were made to allow that trade to become easier. But I think these discussions have been sort of somewhat sidelined by this giant train coming through of these large tariffs. I think what people are certainly talking about is tariffs being imposed on manufactured goods where they haven't been before, and that's the area where it was perhaps easiest to liberalize trade, and that's probably where we're going to see the biggest reversals.
So if you're a country that's just trying to move from that sort of primary producer of agriculture and minerals to the next stage of manufacturing, perhaps in the way that China did 30 years ago, those countries might have a bigger struggle, because if the US or other countries is starting to impose broad broad-based tariffs or barriers on that, it might be that a sort of longer-term consequence of this breakdown in the world order is to make it harder for poorer countries to escape from their dependence on primary products.
Yes, I mean that said, it looks like a lot of the highest tariffs might be imposed on China, which is of course still a developing country, and one of these countries that we are talking about and that is seeking to grow and develop for good reasons. It's
funny to talk about it in that. So we usually nowadays think of China as this economic behemoth, and of course in terms of its scale, it's huge, but its income per person is still way below sort of US or even British standards.
Yes, exactly, and we hope that they also develop and see rises in their living standards as well. But in the fact that these tariffs might be directed against them, there may be opportunities for other smaller manufacturers because the trade might end up being redirected, or the manufacturing might be redirected through these other countries as a ways of evading these tariffs.
So opportunities as well as risks.
Some opportunities as well as risks. But I'd say, I think it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen.
Well, that's probably a very good point to end on, and one that we should probably always end on in the IFS Zooms In. It is very difficult to predict the future. It's quite difficult to understand the present, and often not easy to see what went on in the past. Predicting the future, particularly when it comes to something as complex as trade and as complex as the mind of Donald Trump, is not something we're going to get into. But I hope as we've gone through this, we've at least helped clarify in some people's minds what we mean by a tariff, who might end up paying them, why they can have really quite big and unexpected consequences across the world system, and indeed why they've been at the forefront of economic and political debate for an immensely long time, and I rather suspect they will remain there for a long time in the future, not least partly because there are some genuine trade-offs here, partly because there are very powerful lobby groups who may be in favour of or against them, and partly because the world changes quite dramatically over time in ways that politicians and indeed the populations of countries can often struggle to adapt to, and tariffs can look like at least one of the ways in which they can help to adapt. So thank you, Peter, for that phenomenal run through the economics of tariffs and indeed trade. And thank you for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work, do visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We'll see you next time.